The Dance of the Dragons is the flowery name bestowed upon the savage internecine struggle for the Iron Throne of Westeros fought between two rival branches of House Targaryen during the years 129 to 131 AC. To characterize the dark, turbulent, bloody doings of this period as a dance strikes us as grotesquely inappropriate. No doubt the phrase originated with some singer. The dying of the dragons would be altogether more fitting, but tradition, time, and Grand Maester Munkin have burned the more poetic usage into the pages of history, so we must dance along with the rest. That's one of my favorite bits of writing about this period of Westerosi history. It first appeared as the opening of The Princess and the Queen, a novella-length story first published in the 2013 anthology Dangerous Women, and later expanded on as it became several chapters in Fire and Blood that the show House of the Dragon is based on. I was kind of awed at how episode 4 depicted the fighting between Sunfire and Meleys, and then Meleys and Vhagar, such that you could see where the idea to call it a dance came from. Who would have thought Criston Cole would be the one to deliver one of the hardest hitting statements about the impact of that? Perhaps the fact that he's absolutely no one's favorite character is why he's the best man for the job. Seeing Corlys and Rhaenyra absorbing the loss of Rhaenys alone is a powerful way to start, but what Cole tells Alicent midway through the episode gets to the heart of the conflict in a way that sticks with you. His POV is unique, since you'll remember the reason Rhaenyra said she chose him for the Kingsguard in the first place was because he'd seen battle in the border conflicts with Dorne, which is rare because of the prolonged peace that she inherited from Kings Viserys and Jaehaerys. The Crown Lands campaign strategy is something Aemond and Cole cooked up in this season's premiere. As they experienced success, they realized Rhaenyra would be forced to send a dragon to Rook's Rest, or let one of her council members' castles fall, which gave them the perfect opportunity to set a trap. This likely would have been successful, and gone exactly as planned if Aegon had stayed home. But even in that best case scenario, he'd be sending hundreds of men to storm the castle in the middle of the day as bait for the dragon. You could say these were just the levies, or conscripted soldiers who were defeated and then pledged to the crown to avoid being beheaded as traitors for initially keeping their pledge to Rhaenyra, but they're still human beings. As Criston expresses in his conversation with the Dowager Queen, even as someone who's seen the horrors of conventional warfare firsthand, what he saw at Rook's Rest was uniquely terrifying. What's worse, he knows that once it's been unleashed, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. This is what Rhaenyra was trying to avoid, and why Rhaenys counseled her to exhaust every chance at peace before using the nuclear option. Sadly, the person who was so vocal against it became the first casualty of dragon warfare. And that's not to overlook Luke, but that situation was different. Rook's Rest was our first taste of what the path to winning the Targaryen Civil War looks like. And it should stand out that even when you win, nobody really wins. Except maybe Aemond, who's riding pretty high all things considered, but you gotta love Helaena slipping out of the shadows to ask him if it was worth the price. I mean, you have to love the point she's making, although I'm not sure how much I love that she's threatening him. This might just be me unnecessarily focusing on what a scary dude he is, since she may have already seen how all of this ends and is acting accordingly. The other part of Alicent and Cole's conversation that I think deserves to be front-loaded here is her question, what of justice or temperance? Or is strength now to be our only god? It's a fair question, but not one that I think can be answered as easily as she might like. This comes after what I think was the strongest scene in the episode, where the council chooses Aemond as regent instead of her, essentially making her powerless from here on out. This is a frightening proposition for her, because even though Cole won't admit it, she senses that Aemond played a part in what happened to the king. And while her second son might be more competent in every way, she knows who he is, and what that will mean for the war to come. Plus, we've heard her tell Otto before she has some control over Aegon, which she doesn't feel like she has over her younger son. It's interesting then that a show of strength might be the Greens' biggest mistake in this episode. In an attempt to make Rook's Rest look like a major victory, and to make the grievously injured Aegon look like a hero, they parade Meleys' head through the streets of King's Landing when they return. Through a scene where the blacksmith Hugh's wife begs him to leave the city, we see that the people are already on edge because of the blockade. But as Mysaria explains to Rhaenyra later, the people see the Red Queen's head as an ill omen. This conversation brings one of the few bits of hope that come Rhaenyra's way in the aftermath of her loss. Or maybe just some light that could eventually shine on some hope if it presents itself. I'm not exactly sure what the White Worm is planning, but her instincts seem good. Telling the queen not to underestimate her subjects, something we actively see the other side do, and reminding her that there are other ways to wage war, something that Criston just sort of shrugged at when Alicent brought it up. Mysaria is stepping up to help fill the void that losing Rhaenys created. And I think I like this. It's good to see that someone near power, at least, is concerned about what's happening with the small folk. She sends one of Rhaenyra's house servants, Linda, to King's Landing, and we see her arrive after Aemond shuts down the gates to prevent his subjects from leaving. She's able to name drop Mysaria to get snuck in, and then she goes to a door and starts knocking. I was thinking maybe it was Hugh's place since we saw his family try to leave and get turned away, and then maybe it was Sylvie's brothel since we saw Aemond and Cole knock on her door last season, and then it turns out to be Diana that opens the door. This is the woman who Aegon sexually assaulted when she worked in the Red Keep. Alicent had to go and meet with her to smooth things over by paying her off and making sure she drank moon tea before she forced her out of her job at the castle. She popped back up in episode 3 in the tavern where we met Ulf, who claims to be a bastard Targaryen, and where Aegon and his bros went to pregame before going to Sylvie's. So yeah, not sure how it's all connected exactly, but there's a plan in motion that involves Flea Bottom, and if nothing else, Diana isn't a fan of King Aegon or his family. We learned that he did survive his fall, and that even though his Valyrian steel armor probably helped, he has major burns all over his body, has several broken bones, and Orwell fears there are internal injuries they can't see. He says he's not even sure if he'll ever wake up, and he's pretty much done everything he could, so he tells the council the king's fate lies with the gods now. When they're treating him initially, there's a great shot where Alicent is questioning whether he'll survive. And after he answers a few of her questions, the Grand Maester has to cut her off saying he needs to do his job. Like, this is a really important window of time. She understands and she takes a couple of steps back and then just sort of finds herself there alone, unable to do anything. And it works as a great setup for the scene at the council table later. Aemond strolls in looking unfazed, and after assessing the damage he's done to his brother, he calmly states that someone will have to rule in his stead. The first time I watched this, I thought he cracked a slight smile while he was watching the Maester's work, but there's no reaction at all. It's just this neutral face that Ewan Mitchell uses to always keep you guessing. In between episodes, he gave several interviews where he was asked what was going on in Aemond's mind before he had Vhagar attack Sunfire. And just because there's nowhere else to slip this in, Cole told Alicent they left Sunfire behind because he was well on his way to dying. He wasn't dead yet, but they didn't think he was going to make it. Mitchell told the Wrap, that's one of the compelling arguments that it raises in what Aemond does. Whether or not he always intentionally was going to hurt Aegon somewhere down the line, or whether or not Aegon in that moment was just collateral damage, because he was entangled with Rhaenys. Was the target just Rhaenys, or was it Rhaenys and Aegon? I'm not sure if he saw the completed scene because he may have been playing it that way, but based on how it's edited, it plays more like was the target just Aegon or was it Aegon and Rhaenys? I'm not sure if they wanted to make it more ambiguous and wrote it that way and then looked at the footage and thought it wasn't easy enough to pick up on. But they showed us him attacking his brother. And Aegon went from thinking he was saved to the terror of knowing what was happening just before it did. In another interview with Jonathan Blomberg, he gets at what is really working for this character right now, in my opinion.
I think that's the beauty of Aemond. You don't know what he's thinking. You know, he could be looking at someone thinking about how he wants to take them out for a date. He could be looking at them thinking about how he wants to, you know, make them a meal for Vhagar. You know, and you don't know what it is, but you do know he is thinking. The cogs are turning behind his eyes. And it's the fear in that unknown. You know, it's quite scary when you don't know what someone's necessarily thinking, but they just kind of hold back. They kind of smile. It's like they know something you don't, and I find that scary.
And I would agree with him, it is. And while I don't have a team or even think about it that way most of the time, I mean, Rhaenyra has the better claim without a doubt, but my team has been that they're all terrible in their own way, but also complicated and compelling at the same time. Right now, though, this internal division inside House Green makes them a lot more fun to watch. The idea of someone taking over for Aegon while he recovers, or maybe we should say if he recovers, puts Alicent on her hunt for answers from Cole. In their first conversation, he puts up a wall and won't answer any of her questions or weigh in on her concerns about Aemond at all. They went and did their thing, 900 soldiers died, and the king fought valiantly before falling in battle. Then we get to the small council meeting where the Dowager suggests they install a regent and volunteers for the job. She has experience, and she did the same for Viserys. But Jasper Wilde speaks for everyone, saying that she did a fine job when the realm was at peace, but now things are different. She makes some solid points. Aemond is young, and his lack of restraint has already caused problems. He is a fearsome dragon rider, but that means his skill is best employed in the field, while her experience is what they need at the small council table. And it's almost painful to watch how no one but Orwell even pretends to take her seriously as an option. I think going into this, she thought reason was on her side, that she would be able to make them see this, and in the end she can't even count on Larys or Cole. The latter spends most of the conversation sinking into his chair trying to disappear before speaking as the hand and making it official. Aemond grabs the dumb little ball and takes his seat at the head of the table, and things carry on. Olivia Cooke does a terrific job of portraying how trapped Alicent is in this moment. She can't make eye contact with anyone, and as the camera pushes in, the sound of her breathing gets louder so that it overtakes their discussion, which fades into the background. She can't not listen though, and we hear that Aemond wants Tywin Lannister to get his brother Jason, who we met in the first season, to start trouble with the Rivermen while their banners are in disarray. The council suggests he try to improve relations with the small folk who are suffering, and so he decides to keep them all there. And when he orders the gates closed so that no one can leave or enter, Alicent lets out a quiet gasp, because now the whole city is an extension of the prison she finds herself in. After the meeting, she confronts Criston, which I've already touched on, and beyond the idea that they turned the war over to the dragons and so a dragon rider should lead them, he questions why she doesn't see it as him sparing her. What they have to do now is terrible. And for what it's worth, he's saying this earnestly because he can't imagine she would want to oversee the violence that will be necessary to win. But love her or hate her or both, this is the type of character who likely wouldn't do well with too much time on her hands. She spends her final scene by Aegon's side, who appears unconscious, and then just after she leaves, we hear him try to call for her. This puts them in an interesting place. I've been wondering what they do with Alicent as her power recedes. And my impression from episode 4 is that Aegon 100% thinks his brother, the now acting regent, tried to kill him. Aemond's final scene is of equal interest, if not more so. He's in the throne room looking scary, but also just as he always does, and he's looking at the Iron Throne. It's dark and there's a storm going on outside to provide some mood lightening, before Helaena appears to ask him if it was worth the price. There hasn't been enough Helaena in the previous 2 episodes for my taste, so I'm hoping the fact that he doesn't respond to her means that we'll be getting more of these two together in the next episode. And yes, I do believe that this is her saying that I know you tried to kill my brother husband. So as mentioned, Rhaenyra's side of things opens with Corlys breaking down over the loss of his wife in front of his driftwood throne, and the queen herself taking a quiet moment to reflect alone at Dragonstone. Later we'll see her meet with Baela, because she needs her to go talk to her grandfather and get him to agree to be her hand. The younger woman is visibly broken up, and there's this great little detail when Rhaenyra puts the box with the hand pinned down rather than jumping right into what she needs from her. Remember that Baela lived as a ward of her grandmother on Driftmark in the period after her mother's death. This was also when Corlys chose to stay away, playing at war in the Stepstones for 6 years. These two were close in a way that Rhaenyra admits she never was with Rhaenys, and they bond over the story of how the queen who never was claimed her mount. Baela does take the pin and Rhaenyra's request to Corlys. Steve Toussaint does a very convincing job of making him look untethered. He married Rhaenys when she was 16 years old, so they'd been together for nearly 40 years. I liked the choice to show him in front of his throne because that's all part of his legend. The Lord of the Tides completed his 9 great voyages before he married. I believe HBO is still making a show about that, but they changed it to be an animated series now instead of live action. On those voyages, he went places no one from Westeros had ever been, and in the process put together more wealth than the wealthiest families in the Seven Kingdoms. When Baela finds him at the dock, she mentions his Hall of Nine that we saw in Season 1, which is full of treasures he brought back. It makes his statement that his castle is a tomb, empty and haunted, resonate, and highlights how what he has is no replacement for what he's lost. Baela passes on the offer to become Hand of the Queen, and she really steps up to convince him to take the job. You can see that she inherited her father's reverence for House Targaryen and their history, and it's super satisfying when she calls Corlys out for running away in the past. He doesn't commit, but her saying that she'll see Rhaenyra ascend the Iron Throne gets to him. As she's leaving, he offers to make her his heir, and it sets up one of the best character-defining moments the show's given us, when she says that she's blood and fire. Driftmark must pass to Salt and Sea. And this also must have gotten to him because later we'll see him back in his castle and back on where he grips the Hand of the Queen pin, indicating that he'll take the job, which is good. He might be the only person in her orbit with enough experience to do this, but he's also very qualified. So I said that Aemond is making the Greens more fun to watch, which I think is objectively true. But in an episode that lacks the excitement of the previous installment because it mostly has to deal with picking up the pieces, it does some exciting stuff while developing the characters around Rhaenyra. The same could be said of Jace, who spent most of the season waiting around being frustrated that his mother won't let him get involved. He decides he can't sit still any longer, and again, Baela is there to be the sounding board for her betrothed and helps him realize that heading to Harrenhal to treat with Daemon in an effort to have him reaffirm his loyalty probably isn't the best idea. A better one turns out to be heading to the Twins to try to secure the crossing through an alliance with House Frey. If you watch Game of Thrones, you'll know this house name and this location. Walder Frey, who was very old in the original series, won't be born for something like 70 years. But Rhaenyra needs the same thing from his family that Robb Stark did in GOT. In the premiere, we saw Jace secure 2,000 Greybeard fighters from Cregan and House Stark, who will need to cross the Trident when they make it to the Riverlands. In that scene he shared with the Warden of the North, it was apparent that he has a knack for diplomacy, which is good, because I think it's fair to say that both Daemon and Rhaenyra are bad at it. Plus, it's also been clear that Rhaenyra is not going to let him utilize his drag and get involved in battles anytime soon. Here he treats with who I think are Forrest and Sabbath of Frey, and the situation is fairly complicated. The Freys are sworn to House Tully, but as we learned last week when they sent a kid to meet with Daemon, it's a bit of a fish with no head situation. The Freys don't have an issue with Rhaenyra being queen, they're just afraid that Vhagar will show up and burn their castle down. There's also the threat from Jason Lannister in the west. So if they throw in with the Blacks, and then something happens to slow the Northmen, House Frey would be caught with their pants down. Jace gets them to bend their knees by telling them what they need to hear, and adds the lie that Daemon is also on board to offer protection. Technically, last they heard from him, he could have been counted on to do what his queen commands, but they really have no idea what he's up to now. I'll come back to his adventures at Harrenhal, but Rhaenyra does finally dispatch Alfred Broom there to check on her husband before the episode ends. We see him riding hard with an escort, and I'm no expert on travel times in Westeros, but I'm guessing it would take them at least 5 days, if not closer to a week, to get there if they were able to switch horses regularly. This is good because she has to find out what Daemon's up to, but it'll also be nice to have Alfred out of the small council scenes for a while. Another major factor in why things at Dragonstone have been frustrating at times is that she's not in sync with her advisors. It's a different situation since she's in the seat of power, but she's running into the same problem Alicent had. Her men have pledged their loyalty, but don't back her up. As a woman, they don't believe she can do what's necessary to win. She divulges her own concerns about this behind closed doors with Mysaria, lamenting that her father never prepared her to fight. As previously mentioned, the White Worm channels this into taking action towards other methods of fighting, which is a refreshing turn. Like everyone, Rhaenyra made some missteps this season, some of which have come from being forced into tough choices. One situation where she came off looking insensitive, if not wrong, was in her handling of Rhaena, though. Of course, this was difficult because she was sending away her children in the wake of Ser Arik infiltrating her castle. But the more I thought about their exchange, the more it stands out as not being one of her best moments. Rhaena did step up to follow through on her duty, and we see her tense introduction with Lady Jane Arryn in a brief scene in the Eyrie. We didn't see Jace visit here on his trip north, but he reported that Jane pledged an army in exchange for a dragon. Rhaenyra is sending her youngest son she had with Harwin, Joffrey, to ward with the Arryns, and Lady Jane is unsurprisingly not that excited about turning over 15,000 men for his hatchling. Rhaena holds her own in the initial exchange, and they brought in Amanda Collin, who was the lead in Raised by Wolves for this role, so I'm looking forward to seeing more from the Vale in the upcoming episodes. Daemon's adventures in the Riverlands continue, and this week he brings out Caraxes attempting to bend the Brackens to his will. He also brings Willem Blackwood along, who turns out to be a non-starter for them. I've gone over their generations-long feud and why this would be a bad idea in my previous videos, so this is just a bad decision on his part. He gives them an ultimatum, bend the knee or burn, and to his surprise, they choose fire before turning their backs to him and riding away. Much to Willem's chagrin, Daemon doesn't pull the trigger. Their resolve caught him off guard, revealing them to be exactly the type of warriors he wants fighting on his side. This isn't great news for the Blackwoods, who had already declared for Rhaenyra and were hoping to have their Bracken problem taken care of in exchange for their swords. With diplomacy off the table, Daemon suggests that Willem focus less on fighting and more on persuading, with a sort of wink and nod. Every man has a weakness, but there are some things the crown can't be seen to do. A little later, while he's pitching in on the renovations at the castle, he runs into Alys. This happens right after he hears some spooky screaming that it doesn't look like anyone else can hear. She tells him she heard in the wind that women and children are going missing in Brackenland. And when she sees that he's pleased to hear about it, she points out that these aren't unfortunate acts of war, but crimes against the innocent. Things that any upright man would repudiate. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, before we get to this scene, there's a long dream sequence where he has sex with his mother while she tells him why he's her best boy, and why he was made for the throne and would have been a better king than Viserys if only he'd been born first. Which I imagine this is something that we'll come back to. If you've been watching my videos, you know I've been a big fan of what's been happening with Daemon while he's been at Harrenhal. I've especially been interested in the Alys Rivers character, and her connection to magic and where she might fit into some of the mysteries around the castle over the years. There's still a lot of interesting stuff going on there in this episode, but maybe too much? To the point that it felt a little plodding this time around. Of course, Daemon looks at what's happening to the Brackens as an unfortunate but necessary tactic since they refuse to bend the knee. Alys, whose motivations are still opaque, points out that having men who hate you isn't the best way to build support. She appears to be a champion for the people with her statement that, once again in the name of power, it's the weak and the women who endure. It seems sincere, but also that only seems like part of the story. I feel like there's a lot more going on there. Either way, these aren't views he cares much about, and quickly tries to turn things around saying that Aegon will likely die, and they'll all be in trouble if Aemond takes over. Which kind of sounds like the things Otto would say when he used to talk about how Daemon could never be allowed to rule. Alys is put off by everything he's saying and brings up that she's sure that his tactics are approved by his queen to kind of throw him off. Then Daemon reveals that Rhaenyra can never succeed. The people who support her will not be led by her. They look to a man for strength. He thinks he's the right man for the job, and goes as far as saying that when he takes King's Landing, Rhaenyra is welcome to join him there and take her place by his side. King and Queen ruling together, which also goes along with him asking Sir Simon to start calling him his king. Is this new resolve the result of the dream? Or dreams, I suppose? Is it about whatever's inhabiting his mind since he's been there? Or that paste Alys gave him somehow backfired? Or is he getting a taste of power that feels pretty good compared to the disagreement they had, and in particular Rhaenyra saying he was pathetic when he was last at Dragonstone? It's hard to say, which I guess is a potential issue in a story where you can't tell what's real. Alys is hard to read since we know so little about her, but there are signs of desperation on her face when she tells him it's a pity that he never knew his mother. This catches his attention and appears to be a direct acknowledgement that she knows the contents of his dream. But before they can get into that, Sir Simon arrives with news of a message. In probably my favorite moment of the entire episode, they have him conspicuously look at Alys as she walks past to make sure that we know she's a real person everyone can see. I mean, I guess that's what it's about, because then she moves to a place where he's blocking her so that it looks like she disappeared at the same time. It feels like one of those self-aware or self-referential moments that don't break your immersion. Hey, a lot of you are probably wondering if this character is real. Check out how Simon can see her. Wait, since you can't see her after that, now you're not sure? Now you know how Daemon feels. From Daemon's perspective, the news is good. The Blackwoods have overwhelmed the Brackens, and Aemys Bracken has pledged their banners to him. The celebration doesn't last long, though, because Sir Simon comes to him in the middle of the night, the hour of the wolf to be precise, which is the blackest part of night, to tell him that the River Lords have arrived demanding an audience. Unfortunately, I'm not sure exactly which houses they represent. There are a couple of visible sigils, but when I zoomed in, I couldn't make out the details. This isn't a scene that stands out as being directly related to something that happened in the book, but the bottom line here is that his plan backfired. In the process of wearing the Brackens down, the war crimes didn't go unnoticed, and he lost at least a big chunk of other houses in the Riverlands for his trouble. They also bring up Prince Jaehaerys' murder and say that half the realm believed Daemon was responsible. So this is a bit of a twist and is still a developing situation, so we'll have to wait and see how he reacts in the next episode, since the last shot we see of him has him leaning on the fireplace looking like he can't trust his mind. There's a nice cut to a mirrored image of Rhaenyra doing the same thing at Dragonstone. She looks uneasy as we see Linda arrive at King's Landing and Sir Alfred riding to Harrenhal. In her final scene, we see Jace return from the Riverlands, and his mother tells him she's proud of what he accomplished. She also shares her frustration about not being able to fight, and the reality that if Aemond decides to push his advantage, then she'll be forced to try to defend her family. She laid this out when she returned from King's Landing. Surrender isn't an option since she doesn't have reason to believe that her family would be spared. She has to fight to earn her claim or she'll die. He points out that if Meleys couldn't hang with Vhagar, Syrax probably wouldn't have a chance either. When she says she needs dragons, he points out that the real problem is that they need dragon riders. Vermithor and Silverwing are both big enough to face Vhagar, and they're just living on Dragonstone waiting to be claimed. These two aren't quite as old as Vhagar, but they were the dragons King Jaehaerys and his wife Alysanne rode. And Vermithor is the dragon we saw Daemon sing to at the end of Season 1. She writes off Rhaena as a potential rider because she almost lost her life on her last attempt to claim one. Jace puts forth the idea that there are other people with their blood out in the world who have never ruled. People married into different families and passed their blood on. Rhaenyra is skeptical, explaining that the blood would be thin and that the histories claim a dragon can only be claimed by a dragon lord. But as Jace points out, those are written from the Valyrian perspective, intending to gild its descendants in glory. It might sound crazy to put a Mallister or Tarly on a dragon, but it's better than death and defeat. Their initial thinking is geared towards their high-born distant relatives, but the show has also established that Targaryen princes have been known to produce bastards that would also be running around with their blood. It's a spark for the Blacks when things were looking downright dismal. They need an answer for Aemond and Vhagar, and the episode ends with them feeling closer to finding that. It feels like a hopeful note to end things on, and if you're still rooting for one side to win, then it probably is. But I'll direct you back to the beginning of this video, and Cole's words and the way his voice cracks while he's saying them. What they have to do now is terrible, and I think that's a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.